Okay, I thought it's a really good addition to our series, Relationship Reality Check. I had an opportunity to sit down with Dr. Justin Lehmiller. He's PhD, and he has written a great book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. And everybody wants to improve their sex life. I don't care how good it is, right? I mean, everybody wants to do that.
I would agree with you.
So how did you get into this particular arena?
So this book is an exploration into the science of sexual fantasies and desires, and that's something that's been of interest to me for a long time. I spent 10 years as a college sex educator teaching human sexuality courses to college students around the country, and I just found that the great equalizer among all students, whether they're in the Ivy League or at a big public institution, is that nobody knows any more about sex than anyone else. And so I wanted to, kind of take that approach and provide it to a larger audience.
Yeah, we always say that America, compared to the rest of the world, is kind of puritanical. Is that really true?
Absolutely.
Really?
It's funny that we live in a culture where sex is all around us. We see it everywhere in the media. We see it in advertising. And people from the outside in look at us and think that we're a pretty sexual and open culture. But when you start looking at the way people actually talk about sex, you see that we're very repressed. And we have that puritanical baggage and history that's still dragging on us in a lot of ways.
I'm not in practice anymore. I was in practice for, 12, 15 years. And it's been a long time since I did it. But then when I did, even in the privacy of the therapist room where everything was supposedly protected and people could be frank and honest, people would still get red-faced, dig their toe in the carpet, not want to make eye contact when it came to talking about sex. And if you started talking to them about sexual fantasies, role-playing, any kind of expressing what they were thinking about but not giving a voice, it was like, oh my God. I mean, sometimes you'd bring it up and never see them again.
Right.
They would just never come back. They were just too embarrassed. Why is that in this country? Because it's not that way in France. It's not that way in most of Europe, which is where I've spent a fair amount of time. Why are we that way?
What you're saying reminds me of a point that I make in the book, which is that people find it easier to have sex than to talk about sex.
Oh, absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
is such a big problem. And I think there are lots of fingers that we could point to and blame. And, we can look at the history of the culture in this country. But actually, I think the mental health community has done a lot in terms of stigmatizing a lot of sexual interests that people have. For example, that term paraphilia, which means an unusual sexual interest. We have labeled many, many different desires as paraphilic over the years, which makes people think that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, right.
If it's unusual, people feel like it's a disorder or a problem. And it turns out that a lot of the things that we've labeled as paraphilias are actually pretty normal sexual interests. That's one of the things I look at in the book. Is it's based on the largest survey of sexual fantasies ever conducted in the United States. And one of the things I find, for example, that we've long thought was rare that's really common is interest in BDSM and power play when it comes to sex. Very common.
Yeah. My formula for a healthy relationship is if you're going to have a good marriage or just committed relationship, that has to be based on a solid underlying friendship. And then it's a function of how well it meets the needs of the two people involved. So if you and I are in a relationship, it doesn't matter whether it's friends or marriage or whatever. If we're in a relationship and my needs are getting met at a level of 85%, and yours are getting met at a level of 10%, then my experience of the relationship is going to be really good, and yours is going to be really bad. But if both of us are having our needs met, and then I say you've got two jobs. One is to really work actively to learn your partner's needs, and two is to teach actively your partner what your needs are. Then you've got two people working towards each other. I'm working towards you to try and learn your needs and teach you mine, and you're working towards me trying to learn my needs and teach me yours. Then you've got two people working towards each other, learning and teaching each other what their needs are. Then that's the formula for a good relationship. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense to me.
And if that's happening, then needs are being met, then you would ask yourself, then why would you open a relationship and bring in an interloper? And you're right, because when something's wrong, I've said you're never going to fix a relationship by turning away from your partner. But you're saying if everything's working well, that's when you see it work.
It's when it can work. And this is where I think we need to get into the personalities of the individual partners. Open relationships, polyamory, this is not right for everyone. For lots of people, monogamy is great, works out really well. One thing that I often point to as a personality factor that matters is what's called your sociosexual orientation, which is basically the degree to which you see sex and emotion as going together. Some people see them as very much intertwined. For other people, they're separable. And for the people who see those things as different, they are potential candidates for some type of open relationship or marriage because they're less likely to have all of the extra emotional entanglements and complications that are going to arise from bringing a third person or other person in.
So you're saying they don't look at emotion and sex as being intertwined, going hand in hand. They're more likely to be able to successfully have an open marriage.
Yes.
Yeah. I've always wondered how you bring that up. Not that I want to bring it up, in case Robin's listening. I want to make it very clear. But I've always wondered how you bring that up around the table. Because I can tell you at my house, that would get a black eye. If you're sitting around the breakfast table and you say, by the way, what would you think about, I don't know, having sex with other people? I don't think I would get from the E at the end of people to the period at the end of the sentence without getting punched in the face. How do you bring that up? I don't know how that would work.
So that's actually a big part of the book, is talking about how do you have these difficult conversations with a partner about your sexual fantasies and desires. And you don't want to do it at the breakfast table, like when you're catching your partner in a, sort of very, not sexual kind of state. So I talk a lot about how you got to pick the right time and setting to have these conversations. Ideally, you're both kind of in the mood to talk about sex. You've just watched a steamy movie together, for example. It's finding the right icebreaker to have the conversation and then starting low and going very slow. You don't need to get all your adventuresome fantasies out there right away. It's start with the more vanilla side and work up to it as you've built trust and intimacy and communication.
I've had couples that are trying to have children. So they're having sex when she's ovulating based on her body temperature and stuff like that. And it becomes a chore. They really lose interest because it becomes a chore.
Right.
It's no longer spontaneous. It's no longer sexy, fun. It's a job. And sometimes they never recover from it because it loses all of its spontaneity and sizzle. But once a week, if they've been married 5 years, 10 years, 25 years,
yeah, so this definitely changes over time. What we see is that sexual frequency increases over the first year of a relationship, and then it tends to decrease after that. So in younger couples, you'll see sex more often than once a week. In older couples, it'll be less often. Less often doesn't necessarily mean they're less satisfied, though, because what makes sex satisfying changes as we age, and people place more emphasis on the connection with the partner, and it becomes less about the orgasm and physical gratification.
Realistically, what percentage of the time do men and women have orgasms?
So this is something called the orgasm gap, right? Because we know that men have orgasms on average more often than women. For men, it's in the 90-some percent, usually around 95% is the stat I see in most studies. For women, it depends on what kind of relationship it is. So if it's a marital relationship, I want to say it's in sort of the 2/3. About 66% of women report consistently having orgasms. If you're talking about in dating relationships or casual relationships, the numbers are even lower than that. So, for example, with a one-time hookup, the odds of a woman having an orgasm, for like a college-age woman is about 1 in 3. So it's much lower.
Is that because of anxiety?
I think there's this big part of partner-specific learning. And so what we see is that the more sexual experience that a heterosexual woman has with a male partner, the more her odds of orgasm go up. Another part of it is that, sort of in the hookup culture, there's sort of this prioritization of male over female pleasure. And so when you get into a relationship where there's more equality, then there's more emphasis placed on female pleasure.
I've read about this, and it's been a long time since I have, but the latency between sexual satisfaction for the male versus the female, it seems like the last time I looked at the research, for men, it was like 4 or 5 minutes, and for women, it was like 15 or 20, something like that. Does that still hold true?
Based on the most recent data I've seen, yes. They've done studies where they give men stopwatches,
Yeah.
ask them to record, from penetration to orgasm, how long that takes. On average, it's 5 minutes. For women, it's definitely in that sort of 15-minute mark. And so there's that big, sort of gap there. And we need to think about ways of how do we address that to ensure that everyone's getting their needs met.
Yeah. So suggestions.
Mhm.
I mean, how do you fill that gap? And do you fill the gap between him and her, or do you fill that gap before, ahead of time? I mean, I suppose that's where foreplay comes in. So you both get there at about the same time, or do you fill the gap between him and her? Is there a best way to do that? What's the research say?
So this is where it's going to take some experimentation on your part to figure out what works best for you and your partner. There's never a, sort of one size fits all answer. So one approach is to add more foreplay and incorporate more sexual activities into the mix. What we see is that the more different activities people engage in during a sexual encounter, the greater their odds of orgasm. So mixing it up, doing different things is really key. Also, not looking at the male orgasm as a sign that sex is over, right? There are still things you can do afterwards, other activities. You could incorporate or experiment with sex toys, all kinds of ways you could go to prolong the encounter beyond the male orgasm. And then there are also different sexual positions you can try. One that I talk about a lot on my blog is it's called the coital alignment technique. It's sort of a different way of having sex where the base of the male partner's penis stays in constant contact with the clitoris. And so what we see is that position increases the odds of simultaneous orgasm. And so if you can, sort of take that approach, then that works for some people.
Right. Survey-wise, what's the percentage of couples, or if it's different for men or women, that are comfortable with using like vibrators or other types of sex toys? Where's the breakdown in acceptability between men and women?
So it's interesting when you look at research from nationally representative samples, most men and women have tried sex toys before, but it's something that no one really talks about, right? It's something that in my book, I surveyed people about, fantasies about sex toys. Most people have had those at some point, and we see that most people are trying them at some point, but people aren't talking about it. So I think that there is the openness there, but you're not going to know it unless you're communicating with your partner.
Yeah. Are men threatened by the use of a vibrator or something like that?
Some are, and if they are, they shouldn't be, because you shouldn't be threatened that a piece of machinery is going to take your place. Sex is about so much more than just a mechanical act. It's the connection you have with your partner and all these other things that go into it that make it satisfying in the relationship. You're not going to have a relationship with your sex toy.
Yeah, a vibrator can't keep your feet warm
No.
at night. You talk in your book about the largest survey ever. Were there surprises in there for you? And what were they? Because you've taught this, you've studied it, which means you've discussed this with group after group after group. So everything has been on the table. Were there things that jumped out at you? Were there surprises, and what were they?
Well, I should say that as a sex researcher, very little surprises me anymore.
I'll bet.
But some of the things that I thought were really interesting were, first, that men and women actually had a lot in common when it came to their sexual fantasies. We have these stereotypes about what men want and what women want. And, yes, on average, there are some differences, but for the most part, things that men are fantasizing about are the same things that women are fantasizing about, and vice versa. And that's ultimately good news, because it means that we're going to have a lot in common when it comes to, starting these conversations about fantasies and desires. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was that age piece that we talked about. Almost all the research on sexual fantasies has been based on college students. And if we want to understand human sexuality, we can't just study 18 to 22-year-olds. We need to look at people across the lifespan. And I surveyed people between the ages of 18 and 87. And it shows us that our fantasies and desires evolve considerably over time, and we need to pay more attention to that. For example, some couples watch pornography together, and the couples who watch it together are actually more sexually satisfied because they're using pornography as a way of adding some novelty and excitement into their relationship. So I think what that suggests is that maybe we should stop thinking about pornography as this sort of private, shameful thing that people do in private, but rather thinking about, are there ways that couples can use this together to add some novelty to their relationship?
Right. But do people judge that? Do they feel guilty
Sure.
about it?
People feel guilty about porn. They feel guilty about their sexual fantasies, right?
Really?
And this is one of the biggest things that prevents people from talking about their fantasies, is that they feel shame and guilt. And one of the things I asked people was, for their favorite sexual fantasy of all time, to estimate what percentage of the population they think also has that fantasy. And what I found was that most people underestimated how common their fantasies were, and the rarer they thought their fantasy was, the more shame and guilt and anxiety and embarrassment they felt about it. So that's where we need to, sort of normalize these sexual fantasies, help people understand they're not alone in having them. You don't need to feel shame about it, and be able to have an open conversation about it.
Well, how do we communicate that? It's difficult sometimes to broach the subject. We should have you on, Dr. Phil, and talk about the most common and maybe some of the not so common sexual fantasies, just so people hear it.
Yeah.
Because then they'll think, okay, I thought it was just me. I thought they were going to come get me if I ever said this out loud. We really should talk about that.
Yeah.
If a mother believes that her daughter is sexually active, the responsible thing to me seems, of course, it would be great to have had the conversations with the daughter leading up to this, to where she values herself enough that she will not let some boy use her body as a playground to entertain himself with and leave her with a 20-year obligation of a child.
Mm-hmm.
If that hasn't happened, and there is a young lady, particularly if the father is absent from the home and she's particularly vulnerable to male attention and validation, and is headed headlong into a relationship that she knows is very likely to get sexual in a fast hurry, a lot of mothers will say, I'm encouraging her or validating sexual interaction if I put her on birth control. And there's an argument to be made for that. But my belief is you're not going to stop her when she's in the back seat of a car with her boyfriend. Your best route of action is to keep her from getting in that back seat to begin with. But once she's there, it's too late.
Yeah.
So I think the responsible thing to do is to protect them. Avoidance is best, protection is second. And a lot of mothers think they're encouraging. What do you say to them?
So there are a lot of people who believe that if you give a teenager, tools to protect themselves against, say, STDs, that it's going to give them a license to be promiscuous and that they're going to have a lot more sex. And we've seen this a lot, for example, in discussions about the HPV vaccine recently, right?
Right.
HPV, the human papillomavirus, is the most common sexually transmitted infection, but we have a vaccine now that can protect against the most dangerous strains of that virus that prevent it from turning into cervical cancer or other sorts of cancers, that protect against genital warts. And there's a lot of people who have argued that, well, if you give teens this vaccine, that's going to lead them to be more promiscuous. What the data show is that they're not. They're not any more likely to have more partners or more sex. And so providing teens with these tools, just along the lines of what you were saying, is not necessarily going to make them engage in riskier behaviors. If anything, it will make it more likely that they have safer sex if and when they do have sex.
I couldn't agree more. And I couldn't say it as well as you did, but I agree with you completely.